So protests have been erupting in Turkey, and Istanbul's mayor, Ekrem İmamoğlu, has been jailed.
Yeah.
You've probably seen those headlines, right? But our main source today, this BBC News analysis, it's really saying there's way more to this than just one politician's fate, you know?
Oh, for sure.
It's like a window into some pretty big issues that are happening in Turkey right now.
Absolutely.
And that's why we are going to do a deep dive into it today.
Sounds good.
This isn't just about a mayor.
No, not at all.
It's about so much more.
Yeah, the immediate trigger is definitely the legal action against İmamoğlu, but what's really fascinating is how this has kind of set off all these anxieties about Turkish democracy, the bigger picture.
Right, yeah.
We need to look beyond just this one event to really understand what's going on underneath it all.
Exactly. And for those of us maybe who aren't as familiar with all the details,
Sure.
Who exactly is this guy? Who is Ekrem İmamoğlu? And why has his jailing triggered such a huge reaction?
Well, İmamoğlu is as the BBC puts it, he's a pretty media-savvy guy, a really popular figure.
Yeah.
He's the mayor of Istanbul, which is a super important political role in Turkey.
Right.
And here's the big thing. He's seen as a real challenger to President Erdoğan.
Okay, in the upcoming election.
Yeah, exactly, which are coming up by 2028.
Okay.
And the BBC analysis even kind of hints that Erdoğan might be a little rattled by İmamoğlu,
Rattled. How? Erdoğan's been such a dominant force in Turkish politics for ages.
Oh, yeah, for a long time.
So what makes İmamoğlu like a different kind of challenge, according to the BBC?
Well, there are a few things. I mean, first of all, İmamoğlu is a lot younger than Erdoğan, like 53 compared to 71.
That's a big difference.
Huge difference.
Yeah.
But maybe more importantly, he seems to appeal to a lot of different people, not just one political group.
Okay.
The BBC points out that he even connects with some conservative voters who are usually Erdoğan's base, which is interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting.
And the article also says that İmamoğlu is ready for a long fight, like he's in it for the long haul.
Oh, wow.
That kind of resilience, it's not something Erdoğan has really had to deal with before.
So he's not just another politician. He's like a...
He's a potential game changer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics.
Okay.
Why was he jailed?
Right.
What are they accusing him of?
So the BBC report, it talks about accusations of embezzlement, taking bribes, and even being part of some kind of criminal organization, pretty serious stuff.
Wow.
And we can't forget about his previous conviction.
Right, which is still under appeal.
Exactly, yeah, for insulting election officials.
Right.
And the BBC points out that all these legal challenges together, they could actually stop him from running for president at all.
Oh, wow.
Which makes you wonder if the legal system is being used to influence politics. Right?
Yeah. I mean, this isn't just some isolated legal thing happening. This is affecting the whole political scene.
It's all connected.
Yeah. And that's why the BBC article says that this is far more than a row about the fate of Istanbul's mayor.
Right.
Let's dig into those deeper issues that these protests seem to be tapping into.
Okay, so the BBC News analysis is pretty clear on this point.
Yeah.
They say that freedom and democracy in Turkey have been steadily eroded, especially during Erdoğan's time in power, which has been a long time.
Over 2 decades.
Yeah, as both prime minister and president, a lot of power for a long time.
Right.
And a lot of protesters see this whole thing with İmamoğlu as a turning point, like a chance to push back against what they see as a slide towards, well, basically autocracy.
That's intense. And I mean, the sheer scale of these protests, all the people out in the streets.
Yeah.
It really shows how deeply people feel about this.
Absolutely. And the BBC talks about how risky it is to even protest.
Really?
Oh, yeah. There's tear gas, rubber bullets, bans on protests in certain areas, road closures, even the risk of getting detained. It's serious. And over 1,000 people have already been detained just in the first 5 days of protests, according to the article.
That's a lot.
It is. It shows you how angry people are and how firmly the government's responding.
Yeah, it sounds like expressing your opinion in Turkey can have serious consequences.
It can.
But here's the thing. Turkey always talks about how they have regular elections and high voter turnout, as proof that they are a democracy.
Right.
So how does the BBC article square that with what's happening now and what the protesters are worried about?
That's a really good point. On the surface, Turkey does look like a democracy. They have elections, people vote, and the article even says that Turkish citizens really value their right to vote and that the actual voting process is generally fair.
Okay, so what's the problem then?
Well, the BBC says the problem is what happens when you're not at the polling station, you know?
Away from the voting booths.
Yeah, exactly. There are all these things that affect how fair the political system really is. Opposition politicians getting jailed, critics of the government being silenced in the media and online, protesters getting arrested like we talked about, and media outlets controlled by the government, pushing a certain narrative.
So even though voting itself might be free and fair, the ability of the opposition to actually organize, to campaign, to compete fairly, all of that's being undermined by these other things.
That's exactly it. The BBC analysis is saying that these are huge obstacles for the opposition, even if the voting process itself is transparent.
Okay.
And then they highlight Imamoglu, who seems to be able to cut through all this and connect with voters.
Yeah.
I mean, he's won the mayoral elections in Istanbul 3 times, so he's doing something, right?
Right.
He's figured out how to navigate this uneven playing field better than others.
Which makes his situation even more significant now.
Oh, for sure.
Okay, let's talk about the legal actions against him. The BBC article mentions different opinions about whether these are legitimate legal proceedings or if they're politically motivated.
Right. So, unsurprisingly, the Turkish government says that their courts are independent and they're just applying the law in Imamoglu's case. But the BBC also brings up the views of a bunch of human rights groups and political analysts
Who think differently.
Yeah, they're basically saying that these legal actions are politically motivated.
And the BBC backed that up with some examples, right?
They do. They quote Human Rights Watch, who called the detention of Imamoglu and other officials a politically motivated move to stifle lawful political activities.
Wow.
And they've criticized what they call politicized decisions by courts in Turkey before, so they have a history of seeing this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then there's Imamoglu's own statement on X, where he calls the case a black stain on our democracy.
That's powerful.
It is. And he says he'll stand tall and never bow.
He's not backing down.
Not at all. It really reinforces this idea that it's a political fight dressed up as a legal one.
Absolutely. Okay, so the BBC analysis says President Erdoğan might be feeling rattled by Imamoglu.
Right.
We talked about why before, but could you go into more detail about what specifically about Imamoglu might be worrying Erdoğan?
Sure. The BBC points to a few things. His age, for one, like we said, he's much younger, so he's a long-term threat.
Right.
He's also proven he can win elections, and not just any election, but in Istanbul, a major city, 3 times.
That says a lot.
It does. It shows he has a lot of support.
Yeah.
And he seems to be appealing to a wider range of voters than usual, even some of Erdoğan's conservative base, which is a big deal.
It is.
That suggests that maybe people's loyalties are shifting a little.
Right. And the long fight comment, it suggests he's in it for the long haul.
Exactly. He's not going anywhere. And that kind of resilience is probably something Erdoğan hasn't really faced before.
So it's this combination of his age, his appeal, and his staying power that makes Imamoglu such a threat.
Pretty much, yeah.
But Erdoğan's still got a lot of power, right? I mean, he's been in charge for years.
Oh, he does. The BBC is careful to point that out. He's been in power for 2 decades, built up a huge base of loyal supporters, and his party controls pretty much all the important institutions in the country.
So he's not going down without a fight.
No, definitely not.
So how does the BBC think he's going to handle this?
Well, they think he's probably going to try to ride it out, wait for the protests to die down, hope that people will start focusing on other things, especially the economy.
Yeah, which isn't in great shape, right?
Not really. The BBC mentions the high inflation, 39% in February.
That's high.
It is. And the Turkish lira is losing value, so Erdoğan's probably hoping that people will be more worried about their wallets than about freedom of speech or democracy,
Yeah, practical concerns taking over.
Yes, exactly.
So we've got this really tense, complicated situation going on. What does the BBC say about the future? Could this lead to big changes, or will these protests just fade away?
The BBC asks some really important questions, like will the security forces crack down even harder on the protests? Could there be people killed, which would obviously make things way worse? Is there some point where the pressure on Erdoğan becomes too much?
Those are big questions.
They are, and the BBC doesn't have the answers. Nobody does. It's all up in the air.
And what about the opposition? What are they planning to do?
The BBC says they're planning to keep the pressure on with more protests, more public engagement, but they're also realistic,
How so?
Well, they draw comparisons to protests in other countries with similar situations, authoritarian governments.
Right.
And they point out that quick victories are rare in those cases. It's a long game.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the BBC says the next few weeks are going to be a test of staying power for both sides, the protesters and the government.
So a long standoff, and nobody knows how it'll end.
That's about right.
Okay, so to recap, this deep dive into the BBC News article has shown us that the protests after Imamoglu's arrest, they're not just about him,
No, they're not.
They're about bigger issues in Turkey.
Yeah, like the BBC says, this is about concerns about democracy and freedom being eroded under Erdoğan.
Who's been in power for so long?
Right, and it shows how hard it is for the opposition, even with elections and high voter turnout, because of all the pressure and limitations outside of the voting process.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation.
Very much so.
We started with just a headline about a jailed mayor, but now, thanks to the BBC, we have a much deeper understanding of what's really going on.
We do.
And it really makes you think, Erdogan's been in power for so long, there's so many factors at play.
Right.
What's going to happen next in Turkey?
Yeah, and looking at history, what can we learn from other countries that have faced similar challenges to their democracies?
It's a question worth pondering.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
See you next time.
See you then.